I was walking from the Afghan Ministry of Defense building in Kabul, the 4 blocks back to NATO headquarters, a journey that I made several times a week when I served as the senior NATO advisor to the Religious and Cultural Affairs Directorate of the Afghan National Army in 2014 and 15. The Afghan Ministry of Defense and NATO headquarters were secure areas, but the 4 blocks in between were not. And so I had a 4-person armed escort for protection every time that I went. They became alarmed and on high alert when a group of children ran toward us, shouting and waving their arms. That could be a diversion to cover an attack. Or sadly, the children themselves could be the attackers, suicide bombers, usually forced into such a role by some blackmail scheme of the Taliban threatening to kill the children's families. In this case, however, the children were shouting, "Baba, Baba," which literally means grandfather, but is also the Afghan term of endearment for older persons or respected elders who are male. And that's what these children always called me as they crowded around me every time I made the journey to the Afghan Ministry of Defense. They were street vendors selling scarves as a way to survive if they were orphans, or to help support their families if they still had a family. Either way, they were children of the street in a violent, war-torn city full of terror, and I would always buy a scarf from each one of them. Every payday, I would set aside enough money to buy scarves from all of the children at least twice a week, the usual number of times I went to the Afghan Ministry of Defense. It was something that I felt God wanted me to do, to be generous and supportive of these children who just wanted enough money to buy food. If I had access to any candy, I would also bring that and share it with them. It drove my security detail crazy that we would stop to do this. And sometimes it would take too long, and the person in command of the security detail would urge me, with all due respect, sir, speed it up, chaplain. We have to move. We're sitting ducks out here. But the members of the chaplain's security detail, who called themselves the God Squad, were also willing to risk it. I had asked them beforehand if they were okay with it, and they said yes. They also wanted to help the children. And sometimes they would even give me money beforehand to buy additional scarves, although as enlisted personnel and junior officers, they didn't have the same resources that I was blessed with as a senior officer. I was sending most of my money home when I was in Afghanistan, along with dozens and dozens of scarves, which I have been giving away over the years since. I give them along with a prayer that the child from whom it was bought is still alive and safe and well, and that Afghanistan may be at peace someday soon and free of the Taliban's violent repression, and that veterans and people with post-traumatic stress, which is most of the population of Afghanistan, may find healing, something to remember on this Veterans Day weekend. It is, as the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy in that second reading this morning, Shun the love of money and pursue right relationships. Do not set your hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather on God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Be rich in good deeds and willing to share all that you have, laying up for yourselves treasure that will not decay, but is a good foundation for the future and for life that is really life. In other words, Paul was telling Timothy and us to stay focused on God's promises and God's values and God's priorities, especially in times of transition, in times when things are ending and there are new beginnings that can feel both exciting and hopeful and anxious or uncertain. And that's the point of the parable that Jesus told in our gospel reading this morning from Matthew 25. Now, there are 3 parables in Matthew 25, and we'll read all of them over the next few weeks. They all lift up divine values and gospel priorities for living. This one today, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, is strange. But then many of the parables are strange or challenging when they take an odd twist or turn that doesn't seem to make sense at first. This parable is challenging and unsatisfying in that it appears to almost defy gospel priorities and divine values. Why don't the 5 bridesmaids who took flasks of oil with their lamps share with the 5 sisters whose lamps are going out? And why doesn't the bridegroom let them into the wedding banquet when they return from having to buy more oil? You know, after all, they're bridesmaids. They're part of the wedding party, aren't they? And then what's all this stuff at the end of the story about keep awake, therefore? Because it says all 10 of the bridesmaids became drowsy and fell asleep. So why are the 5 so-called foolish bridesmaids excluded? And then the bridegroom was late to begin with, okay? Late for his own wedding. You know, how rude is that? How foolish is that? You know, what's up with that? What is it about these 5 bridesmaids that is so foolish? And what is it about the other 5 that makes them so wise? Well, first of all, sharing and generosity are divine values and gospel priorities, as the other parables in Matthew 25 will testify. Indeed, all of Scripture makes that clear. You can't remove this one parable from its context. The point is not to not share what you have with all those in need. In fact, it's just the opposite. This parable is part of a call to be generous and to share. The key, I think, is in those words translated to keep awake. Okay, I'm not sure that's the best translation. Literally, they say, be vigilant. Or stay focused. You know, like the men and the women in my security detail in Afghanistan. And like it says in that first reading from the Wisdom of Solomon, fix one's thoughts on God's wisdom, on what God desires, and be vigilant. Singularly focused. Or focused on what is most important, on what are the divine values and the gospel priorities. In the case of this parable, the bridesmaid's job was to accompany the bride and the groom to the wedding banquet. The bridegroom would show up at the home of the bride's family, hopefully on time, and the bridesmaids would light their lamps and carry them in procession to the wedding banquet. They'd have a little parade through the village. The foolish bridesmaids didn't do that because they were off buying oil, and so they missed the procession. They missed the parade. The most important thing for them was to be there for the bride and the bridegroom, to accompany them. Even if they didn't have enough oil for their lamps, they could have still been in the procession. Whether they could light their lamps or not was secondary. Don't take off for any reason and miss the procession. Accompany the bride and the bridegroom. That's what a bridesmaid does. Stay focused. Jesus is saying, don't get off track and make secondary things, even though they may seem important. Don't let them become more important than what really matters. The divine values and the gospel priorities established by God, generosity and sharing. Be rich in good deeds and willing to share all that you have, laying up treasure that will not decay, but is a good foundation for the future and for life that is really life. Trust God's math. Okay? You can't outgive God. This morning, some of you are making pledges or guesstimates for giving in 2024 because you didn't get to do that last week. And some of you watching online will be mailing your pledges to the church. And I hope that all of you will respond to God's call as you consider calling a new pastor by being singularly focused on God's promises, God's values, God's priorities. Okay, that is discernment. You see, in the end, it's not whether you like the pastoral candidate you met yesterday or on Friday, and I hope you did like him, whether he impressed you or not, and do you want to call him? The question is, what does God want? That to the best of your ability, you discern whether God is calling this candidate. That's the focus. Stay focused. And you discern and stay focused on to what God is calling you as you seek to be a courageous steward of all that God has provided. And I want to encourage you all to consider one more thing. Will you buy from every kid selling something and donate something to every cause or organization that a child represents and raises funds for? It's a practice that I adopted years ago. Now, I have to confess it may have something to do with being a pastor, but I think it's really about being the people of God. Pastors certainly get approached by children in the congregation who are raising money for this or that by selling candy or cookies or Christmas wreaths or wrapping paper or whatever it is for clubs and activities at their schools, for scouts or sports or mission trips or church camp or youth group or whatever, and if the pastor says no, oh my God, child could be scarred for life. So I always buy something, and I'm probably setting myself up now, and it adds up, okay? And I will always buy something from a child who comes to the door of my home. and is soliciting a donation. You know, sometimes when those children approach, they are outside of their comfort zone. You know, they are so hesitant and fearful, expecting rejection or even recrimination and a reprimand for daring to knock on the door and bother the occupant or invade the coffee hour at church. And let's be honest, they have met with rejection and unkind words and doors slammed in their faces. And it's so incredible to see the look on their faces, the light in their eyes when one says, "Why, of course, I'd love to buy something from you." Or maybe say, "You know, I don't really need any candy or cookies, but could I just give you $5 for the school band or scout camp or mission trip or, you know, whatever it is?" That look on their face and light in their eyes, you know, makes me feel good. It is part of the fulfillment of Jesus' promise. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Because, I mean, how many $5 scarves that don't really cost $5 does a person need? But I wouldn't trade that cry of "Baba, Baba," as those children crowded around me in Afghanistan for anything. Would you? Be rich in good deeds and willing to share all that you have, laying up for yourselves treasure that will not decay, but is a good foundation for the future and for life that is really life. Amen.